December 10, 1941, Lieutenant Commander Terrell Jacobs fires 15 torpedoes at a Japanese battleship from 900 yards. 0 explode. At 14:23 hours on December 10, 1941, Lieutenant Commander Terrell Jacobs was about to commit what the United States Navy would later call gross incompetence. He did not know that yet. At that moment, he was staring through the periscope of USS Sargo at the most beautiful target a submarine captain could ever see. The Japanese battleship Haruna. 32,000 tons of steel. 8 14-inch guns capable of leveling a city block with a single salvo. Armor, plating 16 inches thick. She was steaming north along the Philippine coast at 18 knots with her entire 700-foot broadside exposed like a gift. Range 900 yards, angle 90 degrees, perfect setup. Jacobs had practiced this exact shot 200 times off the California coast during peacetime exercises. He had never missed, not once. Jacobs touched the photograph in his shirt pocket. His wife, Helen. His daughters, Caroline and Dorothy, 7 years old and 4 years old. He had not seen them in 47 days. If this attack went wrong, if the 2 Japanese destroyers escorting the Haruna detected Sargo and dropped depth charges, his daughters would grow up without a father. 73 men would die screaming in a steel tube as it collapsed under 600 feet of water pressure. Jacobs had attended a submariner's funeral once. Closed casket. There was nothing left to bury. But if he sank the Haruna, he would become the first American submarine captain to destroy a Japanese battleship. Admiral Nimitz would pin a Navy cross on his chest. His face would be on the front page of every newspaper in America. His daughters would be proud of him. 3 days earlier, Japanese aircraft had bombed Pearl Harbor and killed 2,043 Americans. 2 days earlier, Japanese troops had landed on Luzon. The Philippines were falling. Manila would be lost within weeks. The United States was losing this war on every single front. But right now, at this exact moment, Jacobs had a chance to hit back. He made his decision. Prepare to fire. The weapons officer in the forward torpedo room armed tubes 1 through 4. Each tube held a Mark 14 torpedo, 20 feet long, 3,280 pounds. Warhead packed with 507 pounds of Torpex, the most powerful non-nuclear explosive ever developed. The Navy had spent 15 years and millions of dollars perfecting this weapon. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island had tested every bolt, every wire, every chemical compound. They had certified the Mark 14 as the most advanced submarine torpedo in the world. Each one cost $10,000 in 1941 dollars. That was enough money to buy 3 houses in most American cities. The Mark 14 had a secret feature that made it unstoppable. A magnetic influence exploder hidden inside the warhead. The exploder would detect the magnetic field of an enemy ship's steel hull and detonate the torpedo directly underneath the keel. The explosion would create a massive gas bubble that would lift the entire ship out of the water and snap its spine like a breadstick. 1 hit, 1 kill. The Japanese had no defense against it. The technology was so highly classified that submarine captains were forbidden from writing about it in patrol reports. Before Sargo deployed, a Bureau of Ordnance captain had flown to Pearl Harbor from Washington to brief Jacobs personally. The captain was an engineering officer who had never served on submarines. He had never fired a torpedo in combat. He had never been depth charged. But he stood in the wardroom with absolute confidence and told Jacobs 3 things. First, the Mark 14 was perfect. Second, it had been exhaustively tested in 1926 and again in 1935. Third, every single torpedo would perform exactly as designed. The captain smiled when he said it, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "Just follow the procedures," the captain said, "and the weapon will do its job." Then he flew back to Washington. Jacobs gave the order. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as compressed air blasted the first torpedo out of the tube. The weapon shot forward and accelerated to 46 knots, leaving a thin trail of bubbles in its wake. Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, 4 Mark 14. Torpedoes raced toward the Haruna at nearly 50 miles per hour. The torpedo data computer confirmed all 4 were running hot, straight, and normal. Textbook attack. The crew waited in silence. The sonar operator pressed his headphones tight against his ears, listening for the explosions. The executive officer counted down the range. 600 yards, 500 yards, 400 yards, 30 seconds to impact, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. The men in the control room were already smiling. Some were shaking hands. The youngest sailor, a 19-year-old torpedo man from Ohio, was whispering a prayer. They were about to sink a Japanese battleship. They were about to become heroes. They were about to prove that America could fight back. Contact. The sonar operator heard it first. A heavy metallic thud transmitted through the water. Then another thud, then a third, then a fourth. All 4 torpedoes had struck the Haruna's hull. The sound was unmistakable. Steel hitting steel at 46 knots. 4 direct hits on a battleship from 900 yards. The entire crew erupted in cheers. Men were hugging each other. The executive officer was reaching for the phone to call the engine room with the news. Jacobs kept his eye pressed to the periscope. He was waiting to see the battleship break in half. He was waiting for the fireball. He was waiting for secondary explosions as the Haruna's ammunition magazines cooked off. He was waiting to watch 32,000 tons of Japanese steel roll over and sink. The Haruna sailed on. No explosion, no fire, no damage, no list. The battleship continued north at 18 knots as if absolutely nothing had happened. The 2 destroyer escorts maintained their positions. No alarm bells, no searchlights, no depth charges dropped. The Japanese did not even know they had been attacked. The cheering stopped like someone had cut the sound. The control room went dead silent. Jacobs pulled back from the periscope and looked at his crew. Every single man was staring at him with the same expression: confusion, disbelief, horror. The executive officer checked the torpedo data computer again. All settings correct. Depth 10 feet, speed high, magnetic influence exploder armed. Everything done exactly according to the book. The torpedoes had run perfectly. They had hit their target. They had simply refused to explode. Jacobs felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart. Something deeper than that. His faith in the United States Navy, his trust in the engineering officers in Washington who had stood in his wardroom and promised him the Mark 14 was perfect. His belief that his country would give him working weapons to fight this war. All of it shattered in that single moment. But Jacobs was not done. He still had torpedoes. He still had targets. He ordered Sargo to reload and reposition for another attack. It took 45 minutes to maneuver back into firing position. By 15-20 hours, Sargo was 1,200 yards from a massive Japanese transport ship, following behind the Haruna. Intelligence estimated the transport was carrying 3,000 Japanese soldiers and their equipment for the invasion of Luzon. If Jacobs could sink that ship, he would kill 3,000 enemy soldiers before they ever set foot on Philippine soil. He would save American lives. He fired 6 torpedoes, widespread, maximum coverage. He heard 3 impacts. 2 torpedoes exploded. The first explosion tore a hole the size of a bus in the transport's starboard side. Seawater flooded into the troop compartments. Japanese soldiers were thrown against bulkheads. The second explosion destroyed the stern and jammed the rudder. But the third torpedo that hit the transport did absolutely nothing. It struck the hull, hard enough to buckle the steel plating, and bounced off without detonating. The transport began listing heavily to starboard, but it did not sink. Japanese damage control teams were already closing watertight doors and activating pumps. The ship reduced speed to 8 knots and turned toward the Philippine coast, where it could beach itself in shallow water. Without that third explosion, the transport would survive, and 3,000 Japanese soldiers would land on Luzon tomorrow. Those soldiers would fight American and Filipino defenders at Bataan. Those soldiers would force 76,000 Americans and Filipinos onto the Bataan Death March, where 10,000 would die of starvation, disease, and execution. All because one American torpedo refused to explode. Jacobs had fired 10 torpedoes at 2 high-value targets. 7 had hit. Only 2 had detonated. Hit rate 70%. Detonation rate 20%. The most advanced submarine torpedo in the world was failing 8 times out of 10. Sargo limped back to Pearl Harbor on December 28, 1941, after 29 days at sea. Jacobs had not bathed in 4 weeks. He had not eaten a hot meal in 12 days. He had lost 18 pounds. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. But the first thing he did after climbing out of his submarine was write a patrol report. 47 pages documenting every single torpedo failure in excruciating detail. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington received Jacobs's report on January 14, 1942. They read it. They discussed it. Then they sent back a 3-paragraph response that ended Jacobs's faith in his own Navy. The Mark 14 torpedo was the most reliable weapon ever produced. It had been designed by expert engineers and tested successfully. If Lieutenant Commander Jacobs experienced failures, the problem was his approach techniques or his crew's maintenance. The torpedoes were perfect. Jacobs needed better training. The response did not just dismiss his report. It blamed him personally. It called his seamanship into question. It suggested he had endangered his crew through incompetence. The Bureau was not interested in investigating the weapon. They were interested in protecting their reputation. And Jacobs was not alone. 47 submarine captains had filed identical reports. 1943, the submarine force discovers 3 fatal flaws. The Bureau of Ordnance refuses to believe them. On March 20, 1943, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood committed an act that could get him court-martialed. He was standing on a pier at Pearl Harbor, watching the submarine USS Muskellunge prepare to fire torpedoes at a fishing net. Not at Japanese warships, not at enemy convoys, at a fishing net suspended between buoys 800 yards offshore. 8 Mark 14 torpedoes were loaded in the tubes. Each one cost $10,000. Lockwood was about to waste $80,000 of Navy property to prove that the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had been lying for 14 months. He had not asked permission. He had not informed his superiors. He had not filed the required paperwork. If this test failed, if he was wrong about the torpedoes, his career would end. He would be relieved of command, forced into retirement, remembered as the admiral who blamed defective weapons for his own failures. But if he was right, he would prove that the United States Navy had been sending submariners to their deaths with broken equipment while blaming them for incompetence. Lockwood was 52 years old. He had commanded his first submarine in 1914, 29 years earlier. He had spent more time underwater than any flag officer in the Navy. He understood submarines better than the engineering officers in Washington who designed weapons they never fired in combat. And for the past 6 weeks, since arriving at Pearl Harbor on February 7th, he had been reading patrol reports that made him physically sick. 47 submarine captains, 116 war patrols, 14 months of combat operations. Every single report told the same story. The Mark 14 torpedo was failing. Not occasionally, not rarely, systematically. Torpedoes were hitting targets and not exploding. Torpedoes were detonating hundreds of yards before reaching their targets. Torpedoes were running in circles and nearly sinking the submarines that fired them. And the Bureau of Ordnance was blaming the captains. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore had commanded USS Growler. On February 7, 1943, Gilmore attacked a Japanese convoy off the coast of New Guinea. He fired 4 torpedoes at a large transport carrying troops and equipment. 2 torpedoes hit. The crew heard the impacts through the hull. 0 explosions. The transport radioed for help. A Japanese destroyer arrived 20 minutes later and spotted Growler running on the surface, trying to recharge batteries.
The destroyer turned toward Growler at full speed. Gilmore tried to crash dive, but there was no time. The destroyer rammed Growler's bow, tearing a hole in the pressure hull. The collision threw Gilmore against the bridge railing. Water flooded into the conning tower. Gilmore was bleeding from a head wound. He could have climbed down the hatch. He could have sealed himself inside. Instead, he shouted his last order. "Take her down." The diving officer hesitated. Gilmore screamed it again. "Take her down." The hatch slammed shut. Growler dove. Gilmore drowned on the bridge, clinging to the railing as the submarine disappeared beneath him. Growler survived. 46 men lived because their captain sacrificed himself. But Gilmore should never have been in that situation. If those 2 torpedoes had exploded, the transport would have sunk. The destroyer would never have been called. Gilmore would have gone home to his wife and daughter in Connecticut. He died because the Mark 14 failed, and the Bureau of Ordnance had blamed captains like Gilmore for incompetence. Lockwood had read Gilmore's patrol report a dozen times. He had read 46 others just like it. The pattern was undeniable. Between December 7, 1941 and February 28, 1943, American submarines had fired 1,442 Mark 14 torpedoes at Japanese targets. Confirmed sinkings totaled 23 ships, success rate 1.6%. The other 1,419 torpedoes had either missed, malfunctioned, or failed to detonate. Every failed torpedo had consequences that rippled across the entire Pacific. A transport that escaped delivered 3,000 Japanese soldiers to frontline garrisons. Those soldiers killed Americans at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and 100 other islands. A tanker that survived carried 10,000 tons of fuel oil to Japanese carriers. Those carriers launched aircraft that bombed American positions for months. A cargo ship that made it home brought raw materials to factories producing weapons that killed more Americans. The Mark 14 failures were extending the war and costing thousands of lives. But the Bureau of Ordnance refused to acknowledge any problem existed. Lockwood had called a meeting with his submarine captains on February 15, 1943. 32 commanders attended. These were men who had survived depth charge attacks that should have crushed their submarines like beer cans. Men who had dodged aircraft bombs and destroyer ramming attempts. Men who knew more about combat operations than anyone in Washington. And every single one told Lockwood the same thing. The Mark 14 does not work. Lockwood had listened for 3 hours. Then he told them something no admiral had said before. "I believe you. The torpedo is defective, and I am going to prove it, even if it ends my career." The problem was the Bureau of Ordnance had tested the Mark 14 exactly twice in 15 years. Once in 1926, once in 1935. Both tests fired a single torpedo at a stationary barge. Both torpedoes detonated. The Bureau declared the weapon perfect based on 2 successful shots and stopped testing. They never fired at a moving target. They never tested the magnetic exploder against an actual ship. They used mathematical calculations to predict performance and assumed the math was correct. Lockwood decided to run real tests with real torpedoes under real conditions. That was why he was standing on this pier, watching Muskelung prepare to fire at a fishing net. The net was suspended between buoys with depth markers every 5 feet. 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet, 25 feet. Lockwood had set the torpedoes to run at 10 feet depth. If the Mark 14 was working correctly, the torpedoes would pass through the net at the 10-foot marker. If they were running deep, they would hit lower markers. Simple test, undeniable results. Muskelung fired the first torpedo. The weapon left the tube, accelerated to 46 knots, and streaked toward the net. It passed through at the 21-foot marker, 11 feet deeper than the setting. Lockwood felt his stomach drop. He ordered Muskelung to fire again. Same result, 21 feet. He ordered 6 more shots with different depth settings. Every single torpedo ran 11 feet deeper than programmed. Lockwood stared at the shredded fishing net and understood what had happened. For 14 months, submarine captains had been setting torpedoes to run at 10 feet depth to hit enemy ships at the waterline. But the torpedoes were actually running at 21 feet, passing harmlessly underneath their targets. Thousands of attacks had failed, not because captains were incompetent, but because the depth mechanism was broken, and the Bureau of Ordnance had been blaming the captains. Lockwood returned to his office and wrote a detailed report. He included photographs of the fishing net with torpedo holes at the wrong depths. He included data from all 8 test firings. He stated clearly that the Mark 14 depth mechanism was defective and required immediate correction. He sent the report to Washington on March 22, 1943, and requested authorization to modify all torpedoes in the Pacific Fleet. The Bureau of Ordnance responded on March 30th. They rejected Lockwood's findings completely. The Mark 14 depth mechanism had been tested extensively at Newport and found accurate. If Admiral Lockwood's torpedoes were running deep, the problem was improper maintenance by submarine crews or incorrect test procedures. The Bureau would not authorize modifications. The message was signed by Rear Admiral William Blandy, head of the Bureau of Ordnance. Lockwood read the response 3 times. According to officers who saw him that day, his face turned red and he crumpled the message into a ball. Then he walked across the yard to the submarine maintenance facility and found the chief torpedo machinist, a man who had been servicing submarine weapons for 18 years. Lockwood showed him the Bureau's response and asked one question. "Can you fix this?" The chief read the message, looked at Lockwood, and said, "Yes, sir. 3 days." Lockwood gave an order that violated every regulation in the Navy. Modify every Mark 14 torpedo at Pearl Harbor. Strip out the defective depth mechanism and rebuild it to run 11 feet shallower. Do it without authorization from Washington. Do it now. If the Bureau wanted to court-martial him for insubordination, they could do it after his submarines started sinking Japanese ships. The modification took 11 days. By April 10, 1943, every submarine at Pearl Harbor carried torpedoes with corrected depth mechanisms. Lockwood sent them to sea and waited. USS Tunney departed on April 12th, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Scott. On April 24th, Tunney encountered a Japanese convoy east of the Philippines. 3 cargo ships with 2 destroyer escorts. Scott fired 4 torpedoes at the lead ship from 200 yards. All 4 ran at correct depth. 3 hit. All 3 exploded. The cargo ship broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. Scott fired 2 more torpedoes at the second ship. Both hit. Both exploded. The ship caught fire and went down burning. Reports flooded back to Pearl Harbor. USS Harder sank 3 Japanese destroyers in 4 days. USS Tang destroyed 2 transports and a tanker in 1 patrol. USS Silversides sank 5 cargo ships in 3 weeks. In March, before the modification, American submarines had sunk 12 Japanese ships. In April, they sank 31. In May, they sank 42. The sinking rate had more than tripled. The only thing that changed was fixing the depth mechanism Lockwood had modified without permission. Lockwood sent updated statistics to Washington on May 15, 1943. The Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the data and on June 10th issued a technical bulletin authorizing the depth modification for the entire submarine force. They did not apologize. They did not acknowledge error. They simply instructed all submarines to adjust depth settings by 11 feet, as if this had been their idea from the beginning. But Lockwood was not celebrating, because fixing the depth mechanism had revealed a second catastrophic problem. Torpedoes were now running at correct depth and hitting targets, but they were still failing to explode far too often. The magnetic influence exploder, the secret weapon that was supposed to make the Mark 14 unstoppable, was detonating torpedoes hundreds of yards before they reached their targets. On June 24, 1943, USS Tenosa, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, encountered the Japanese tanker Tonin Maru No. 3. 19,000 tons, No escorts. Dead in the water, with engine problems. The most perfect target Daspit had ever seen. He maneuvered to 200 yards and fired the first torpedo. It exploded 200 yards short. Magnetic exploder. Daspit fired again with the magnetic exploder disabled. The torpedo hit and exploded. The tanker began listing. Daspit fired 13 more torpedoes. 11 hit. 9 failed to detonate. The tanker survived. Daspit returned to Pearl Harbor on July 8th with 1 torpedo remaining and a rage that could melt steel. He had hit a stationary tanker 11 times and failed to sink it because the contact exploder was defective. Lockwood read the report and realized the Mark 14 had 3 separate fatal flaws. The depth mechanism ran too deep. The magnetic exploder detonated prematurely. And the contact exploder was so fragile, it crushed on impact without triggering the warhead. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent 15 years developing a weapon with 3 catastrophic defects and blamed submarine captains when it failed. Lockwood was about to start the biggest fight of his career. And this time, the Bureau of Ordnance would not be able to ignore him. September 1943. Admiral Lockwood declares war on the Bureau of Ordnance and proves they lied about everything. On September 24, 1943, at 10:15 hours, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood stood at the base of a 90-foot construction crane at the Pearl Harbor submarine base and ordered his men to drop a 507-pound Mark 14 warhead onto a steel plate. The test was simple. The Bureau of Ordnance had designed the Mark 14 contact exploder to detonate when the torpedo struck an enemy ship's hull at 46 knots. That impact created a force of approximately 500 pounds per square inch. Lockwood's engineers had calculated that dropping the warhead from 90 feet onto a steel plate would generate exactly the same force. If the exploder worked as designed, it would detonate. If it failed, the Bureau had lied about everything. Lockwood had not asked permission from Washington to conduct this test. He had learned that lesson back in March when he tested the depth mechanism. The Bureau would say no. They would order him to stop. They would threaten his career. So Lockwood simply stopped asking. He was fighting 2 wars now. One against the Empire of Japan, one against his own Navy's bureaucracy. And he was not sure which enemy was more dangerous. 37 officers and enlisted men stood in a semicircle around the test site. Submarine captains who had survived torpedo failures, torpedo technicians who maintained the weapons, engineers who had spent months trying to understand why the Mark 14 kept failing. Every man present knew this test would either vindicate them or destroy their careers. If the warhead detonated, it proved the contact exploder worked and the submarine force had been making excuses for poor performance. If it failed to detonate, it proved the Bureau of Ordnance had been sending submariners into combat with defective weapons for 21 months, while blaming them for the failures. Lockwood gave the signal. The crane operator released the cable. The 507-pound warhead dropped 90 feet and hit the steel plate at terminal velocity. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The steel plate buckled. The warhead bounced 3 feet into the air and landed on its side. No explosion. The torpex inside the warhead, enough explosive to sink a destroyer, did not detonate. Lockwood walked over to the warhead and examined the nose. The firing pin, the mechanism that was supposed to trigger the detonator when the torpedo hit a target, had crumpled like aluminum foil. It had crushed flat without triggering anything. Lockwood ordered his men to reload and drop another warhead. Same result. The firing pin crushed. No detonation. He ordered a third drop. Same result. He dropped 6 warheads that morning. Not one exploded. The contact exploder that the Bureau of Ordnance had certified as reliable was failing 100% of the time when subjected to the exact impact force it was designed to handle. Lockwood stared at the 6 crumpled warheads lying on the concrete and felt a rage so intense he could barely breathe. For 21 months, submarine captains had been firing torpedoes that hit enemy ships and failed to explode. For 21 months, those captains had filed reports documenting the failures. For 21 months, the Bureau of Ordnance had responded by accusing the captains of incompetence. And now, Lockwood had proof that the Bureau had been lying the entire time. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit was standing next to Lockwood. Daspit was the captain of USS Tenosa, the submarine that had hit a Japanese tanker 11 times without sinking it. Daspit had returned from that patrol so furious he could barely speak. He had executed a perfect attack on a defenseless target and accomplished nothing because the torpedoes did not work. The Bureau had suggested Daspit needed better training. Daspit looked at the crumpled warheads and said what everyone was thinking. They knew. The Bureau knew the exploder was defective and they sent us to sea anyway. Lockwood did not disagree. The Bureau had conducted only 2 live fire tests of the Mark 14 in 15 years, both tests in the 1920s, both against stationary barges. They had never tested the contact exploder under realistic conditions. They had used mathematical calculations to predict performance and assumed the math was perfect. When submarine captains reported failures in combat, the Bureau dismissed the reports rather than conduct actual tests. They had prioritized protecting their reputation over American lives. Lockwood returned to his office and wrote the most important message of his career. He documented every test. He included photographs of the crumpled firing pins. He provided detailed calculations showing that the contact exploder failed under the exact conditions it was designed to handle. He stated clearly that the Mark 14 contact exploder was catastrophically defective and required complete redesign. He demanded authorization to disable the contact exploder on all torpedoes and replace it with a simpler mechanism that actually worked. Then Lockwood did something no flag officer had done before. He sent copies of the report to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. He bypassed the Bureau of Ordnance entirely and went directly to the 2 most powerful admirals in the Navy. Lockwood was betting his career that Nimitz and King would support him over the Bureau. If he was wrong, he would be relieved of command within a week. The response came faster than Lockwood expected. Admiral Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on September 28th, 4 days after the crane test. Nimitz had read Lockwood's report on the flight from San Francisco. He had read the patrol reports from 47 submarine captains. He had reviewed the statistics showing that American submarines were achieving a 1.6% success rate with the Mark 14, and he was furious. Nimitz called a meeting in his office with Lockwood and Rear Admiral William Blandy, who had flown in from Washington to defend the Bureau of Ordnance. According to officers who were briefed on the meeting afterward, it was the closest thing to a fistfight between flag officers that anyone had ever witnessed. Blandy argued that the contact exploder was functioning correctly and that submarine failures were caused by improper firing techniques. He stated that the Bureau's engineers had designed the weapon using the best available data and that questioning their work was insulting to men who had devoted their careers to naval ordnance. He suggested that Admiral Lockwood was making excuses for poor submarine performance. Lockwood responded by placing 6 photographs on Nimitz's desk. Each photograph showed a crumpled firing pin from a Mark 14 warhead dropped from the crane. Lockwood asked Blandy one question. If the contact exploder works correctly, why did 6 warheads fail to detonate when subjected to the exact impact force they were designed to handle? Blandy had no answer. He argued that the crane test did not replicate actual combat conditions. Lockwood responded that combat conditions were worse because torpedoes hit moving targets at angles, which generated even more stress on the firing pin. If the exploder could not survive a perpendicular drop onto a flat plate, it would certainly fail when hitting a ship's curved hull. Nimitz ended the meeting by issuing a direct order. All Mark 14 torpedoes in the Pacific Fleet would have their contact exploders disabled immediately. Submarine captains would use a simpler exploder design that triggered on impact without relying on the defective firing pin mechanism. The modification would begin immediately, without waiting for authorization from the Bureau of Ordnance. Blandy protested that this decision violated procurement regulations and undermined the Bureau's authority. Nimitz responded that he did not care about regulations. He cared about sinking Japanese ships. The meeting ended. Blandy flew back to Washington. Lockwood walked out of Nimitz's office, knowing he had just won the biggest battle of his career. The contact exploder modification began on October 1, 1943. Submarine tenders worked around the clock, disabling the defective mechanism on every torpedo at Pearl Harbor. By October 15th, the entire Pacific submarine force was equipped with modified Mark 14 torpedoes that had all 3 defects corrected. The depth mechanism ran at the correct depth. The magnetic exploder had been disabled to prevent premature detonations. The contact exploder had been replaced with a simple impact trigger that worked. The results were immediate and devastating. For Japan, USS Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor on October 21, 1943, commanded by Commander Dudley Morton. The same Dudley Morton who had nearly been killed by a circling torpedo back in February 1942. The same Morton who had written that the Mark 14 was more dangerous to American submarines than to Japanese ships. Morton took Wahoo into the Sea of Japan and started hunting. On October 26th, Wahoo encountered a Japanese convoy, 4 cargo ships with 1 destroyer escort. Morton fired 8 torpedoes. 7 hit. 7 exploded. All 4 cargo ships sank. The destroyer fled. Morton continued hunting. Over the next 6 days, Wahoo sank 9 more Japanese ships, 13 ships destroyed in 1 patrol. It was the most successful submarine patrol in the history of the United States Navy. USS Tang, commanded by Commander Richard O'Kane, departed in November 1943. O'Kane sank 5 Japanese ships in 12 days. USS Harder, commanded by Commander Samuel Dealey, sank 6 destroyers in 1 patrol, destroying more Japanese destroyers than most submarines sank in their entire service life. USS Flasher, USS Barb, USS Archerfish, every submarine with corrected torpedoes was achieving results that had been impossible for the previous 21 months. The statistics told the story. In September 1943, before the contact exploder fix, American submarines sank 42 Japanese ships. In October, after the fix, they sank 68 ships. In November, they sank 81 ships. In December, they sank 97 ships. The sinking rate had more than doubled. The only thing that changed was replacing the defective Bureau of Ordnance exploder with a mechanism that actually worked. By the end of 1943, American submarines were destroying Japanese merchant shipping faster than Japan could replace it. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies stopped reaching Japanese ports. Cargo ships carrying raw materials were sinking by the dozens. Transport ships delivering troops and supplies to island garrisons never arrived. Japan's economy began collapsing. Their carriers sat in port without fuel. Their factories shut down without raw materials. Their soldiers starved on islands that could not be resupplied. The Mark 14 torpedo, with all 3 defects finally corrected, had become the weapon it was supposed to be from the beginning, and the American submarine force had become the most lethal naval weapon in the Pacific War. But the victory came 21 months late, 21 months during which Japanese ships sailed almost unopposed, because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit their weapon was defective. Lockwood never received an apology from the Bureau of Ordnance. They never acknowledged their mistakes. They never admitted they had blamed submarine captains for engineering failures. But Lockwood did not care about apologies. He cared about results. And by the end of 1944, American submarines would sink more than 600 Japanese ships in 12 months. They would destroy 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. They would cut off the flow of oil, food, and materials that kept Japan's war machine running. And it happened, because one admiral refused to accept that defective weapons were acceptable, because he was willing to risk his career to prove the truth, because he believed his submarine captains when everyone else called them incompetent. Admiral Charles Lockwood saved the American submarine campaign. But first, he had to fight his own navy to do it. 1944, with working torpedoes, U.S. submarines sink 600 Japanese ships in 12 months. On January 31, 1944, Commander Richard O'Kane was hunting off the coast of the Caroline Islands when his radar operator detected a Japanese convoy. 14 ships, 3 tankers, 6 cargo vessels, 5 transports loaded with troops, escorted by 4 destroyers. It was the largest convoy O'Kane had seen in 8 months of combat patrols. Before October 1943, before Admiral Lockwood fixed the Mark 14 torpedo, O'Kane would have attacked this convoy and achieved nothing. He would have fired 20 torpedoes, scored perhaps 10 hits, and sunk maybe 2 ships if he was lucky. The rest would have escaped because the torpedoes would fail to explode. But O'Kane was not carrying the old Mark 14 anymore. He was carrying torpedoes with corrected depth mechanisms, disabled magnetic exploders, and redesigned contact triggers that actually detonated on impact. He was carrying weapons that worked, and he was about to prove what American submarines could accomplish when their own navy stopped sabotaging them. USS Tang approached the convoy at periscope depth. O'Kane maneuvered into position between the convoy and the setting sun, so Japanese lookouts would be blinded by glare, classic submarine tactics. But tactics only mattered if the weapons worked. For 2 years, submarine captains had executed perfect attacks and failed because the Bureau of Ordnance had given them defective torpedoes. That era was over. O'Kane fired 6 torpedoes at the 3 tankers. All 6 ran hot, straight, and normal. All 6 hit. All 6 exploded. 3 tankers, each carrying 10,000 tons of fuel oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, erupted in fireballs visible for 20 miles. The explosions were so massive that one tanker's bow section shot 60 feet into the air before crashing back into the ocean. Secondary explosions cooked off as burning fuel oil, ignited ammunition stored in crew quarters. Within 8 minutes, all 3 tankers had sunk. 30,000 tons of fuel that would never reach Japanese aircraft carriers. Fuel that would never power Japanese fighters bombing American positions. O'Kane reloaded and fired 4 torpedoes at the cargo ships. 3 hit, 3 exploded. 2 cargo ships sank immediately. The 3rd caught fire and began listing but remained afloat. O'Kane fired 1 more torpedo. Direct hit. The cargo ship broke in half. Both sections sank within 2 minutes. Those 3 cargo ships had been carrying steel, aluminum, and copper from mines in China and Malaya. Raw materials destined for factories in Osaka and Tokyo. Materials that would have become aircraft, tanks, and artillery shells. Now they were scattered across 2,000 feet of ocean floor. The 4 Japanese destroyers finally reacted. They turned toward Tang's last known position and increased speed to 28 knots. Depth charges began falling. O'Kane took Tang deep, rigged for silent running, and slipped away while the destroyers wasted explosives on empty water. By sunset, Tang had escaped. 6 enemy ships destroyed. 0 damage to Tang. 100% weapon reliability. O'Kane's patrol report landed on Admiral Lockwood's desk 3 weeks later. Lockwood read it twice. Then he walked down the hall and showed it to his staff. "This is what we should have been doing since December 1941, he said. "This is what happens when submarine captains get weapons that actually work." O'Kane was not alone. Across the Pacific, American submarines with corrected Mark 14 torpedoes were achieving results that would have been impossible a year earlier. Commander Samuel Dealey in USS Harder encountered a Japanese destroyer on April 13, 1944, near Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines. Destroyers were submarine killers. Fast, maneuverable, equipped with depth charges and sonar. Submarine doctrine said to avoid destroyers. Dealey decided to hunt them instead. He fired 3 torpedoes from 1,500 yards. All 3 hit. The destroyer broke in half and sank in 90 seconds. Dealey wrote in his report, "Destroyer taken under fire, destruction complete, continuing patrol." Over the next 6 days, Dealey sank 4 more destroyers. 5 destroyers destroyed in 1 week. He radioed Pearl Harbor with a message that became legendary in the submarine force. Destroyed another can, running out of destroyers. The Japanese Navy had started the war with 175 destroyers. They were losing them faster than they could build replacements, and they were losing them to American submarines that had spent 2 years fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Commander Eugene Fluckey in USS Barb took his boat into shallow water off the China coast in January 1944. Japanese convoys had started hugging the coastline in water, too shallow for submarines to operate safely. Fluckey ignored the shallow water restrictions. He took Barb into 40 feet of water, barely enough clearance for the submarine to submerge, fired 8 torpedoes at a convoy anchored offshore, and sank 4 cargo ships before escaping. He wrote, "Textbooks say submarines cannot operate in shallow water. Textbooks are wrong." Commander Lawson Ramage, the same Ramage who had hit 6 targets and achieved only 3 detonations in 1942, took USS Parche into Davao Gulf in July 1944. Ramage encountered a Japanese convoy in a narrow channel with no room to maneuver. He surfaced Tang in the middle of the convoy at night and started firing torpedoes at point-blank range. 12 torpedoes fired, 11 hit, 11 exploded, 5 cargo ships sank. Ramage then spent 40 minutes shooting up the survivors with deck guns while Japanese shore batteries fired back. Parche escaped with minor damage. Ramage received the Medal of Honor. He could have received it in 1942 if his torpedoes had worked. The statistics were staggering. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese ships. In 1943, before the torpedo fixes, they sank 335 ships. In 1944, with fully corrected Mark 14 torpedoes, they sank 603 ships. The sinking rate had more than tripled. American submarines were destroying 1 Japanese merchant ship every 14 hours. Japan's economy was collapsing. The Empire of Japan had started the war with 684,000 tons of merchant shipping. Tankers, cargo ships, transports, refrigeration vessels, everything needed to move oil, food, and materials across the Pacific. By December 1944, American submarines had sunk 3,506,000 and 6,000 tons, 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet destroyed. And the submarines had accomplished this with less than 2% of total U.S. Navy personnel. The consequences were catastrophic for Japan. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies stopped reaching Japanese ports. By mid-1944, Japan's oil imports had dropped 80%. Aircraft carriers sat in port without fuel. The super battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, spent most of 1944 anchored at Kure, because Japan could not spare fuel for her engines. The Imperial Japanese Navy had become a fleet that could not sail. Food shipments from Southeast Asia stopped reaching Japan. Rice imports dropped 70%. The Japanese government implemented rationing so severe that average daily caloric intake fell below starvation levels. Citizens in Tokyo and Osaka were eating acorns, tree bark, and sawdust mixed with rice. Industrial workers collapsed from malnutrition at their machines. Factory productivity plummeted because workers were too weak to operate equipment. Raw materials stopped flowing to Japanese factories. Steel production dropped 60%. Aluminum production dropped 75%. Japan could not build aircraft fast enough to replace combat losses. By late 1944, Japanese aircraft production had fallen to less than half of 1943 levels, despite desperate attempts to increase output. The factories had no raw materials to work with. American submarines had cut Japan's industrial throat. Japanese garrisons on Pacific islands began starving. Supply convoys could not get through the submarine blockade. On truck, 40,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors went on half rations in March 1944 and quarter rations by June. On Rabaul, Malnutrition and disease killed more Japanese than American bombing raids. On dozens of smaller islands, entire garrisons starved to death, waiting for supply ships that never arrived because American submarines had sunk them. The Japanese Navy tried everything to adapt. They organized convoys with multiple destroyer escorts. They routed shipping through shallow coastal waters where submarines supposedly could not operate. They used aircraft for convoy reconnaissance. Nothing worked. American submarines hunted in wolf packs. They intercepted convoy routes based on intelligence from decoded Japanese radio traffic. They ambushed ships in harbor approaches. They operated with complete impunity because they finally had weapons that functioned as designed. Commander Dudley Morton, who had written in 1942 that the Mark 14 was more dangerous to American submarines than to Japanese ships, took USS Wahoo into the Sea of Japan in October 1943. It was the most dangerous patrol in submarine warfare. The Sea of Japan was surrounded by enemy territory with only 2 narrow straits for escape. Morton did not care. He took Wahoo through the minefields into Japanese home waters and started hunting. Over 6 days, Morton sank 9 Japanese ships. Tankers, cargo vessels, transports, everything he could find. It was the most successful patrol of his career. It would also be his last. On October 11, 1943, Japanese aircraft spotted Wahoo transiting La Perouse Strait on the surface. They attacked with bombs and depth charges. Wahoo went down with all hands. 80 men died, including Morton. But Morton died doing what he had been trying to do since December 1941, sinking Japanese ships with torpedoes that actually worked. His final patrol proved what American submarines could accomplish when given functional weapons. And every submarine captain who sailed after Morton knew they owed their success to men like him, who had fought for 2 years with defective equipment and refused to give up. By September 1944, Japan's military situation was hopeless. Their fleet had no fuel. Their factories had no raw materials. Their soldiers had no food. American submarines operating with corrected Mark 14 torpedoes had accomplished what 2 years of surface naval battles and air campaigns had not. They had cut Japan's lifeline. They had destroyed the economic foundation that sustained Japan's war machine. And they had done it with 288 submarines, less than 2% of America's total military force. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to Admiral Lockwood on October 15, 1944. The message was brief. The submarine force has exceeded all expectations. Continue operations. It was the closest thing to an apology Lockwood would ever receive from Washington. King never acknowledged the Mark 14 failures. He never admitted the Bureau of Ordnance had been wrong. He never apologized for the 2 years American submarines had wasted fighting with defective weapons. Lockwood did not care about apologies. He had proven his point. He had saved the submarine campaign. He had vindicated every captain who had been accused of incompetence when their torpedoes failed. And he had shown what American determination could accomplish when bureaucracy stopped getting in the way. But the victory came with a cost that haunted Lockwood for the rest of his life. 21 months lost. 21 months during which Japanese ships sailed almost unopposed. 21 months during which Japan fortified islands, moved troops, and stockpiled supplies. How many American soldiers and Marines died assaulting islands that should have been isolated and starved by submarine blockade in 1942? How many aircraft carriers survived because torpedoes fired in early 1942 failed to explode? How many more months did the war last because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit their weapon was defective? Lockwood never spoke those questions out loud, but they were there in every patrol report he read, in every casualty list, in every submarine that left Pearl Harbor, knowing that 2 years earlier, their weapons would have failed them. The war was not over yet, and one final tragedy was waiting in the waters between Guam and Leyte Gulf. A tragedy that would kill more American sailors than any other naval disaster in U.S. history. A tragedy that never should have happened, because the Japanese submarine that caused it should have been destroyed in 1942 if American torpedoes had worked. USS Indianapolis was about to deliver the uranium core for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. And on the return voyage, she would meet a Japanese submarine that 2 years of Mark 14 failures had allowed to survive. July 30th, 1945. USS Indianapolis, the final victim of the torpedo problem, nobody fixed in time. At 00:05 hours on July 30th, 1945, Captain Charles McVeigh stood on the bridge of USS Indianapolis, watching the moonlight reflect off calm Pacific waters. The war was almost over. Everyone knew it. Germany had surrendered on May 8th. Japan was collapsing under relentless bombing. American forces controlled the Pacific. Victory was weeks away, maybe days. McVeigh had just completed the most important mission of his career. Indianapolis had delivered the uranium core for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. The weapon that would end the war was being assembled at that exact moment. McVeigh's job was done. All he had to do was get his ship and his 195-man crew home safely. Indianapolis was steaming from Guam to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. 1,200 miles through waters the Navy considered secure. No escort destroyers, no zigzag pattern, no submarine threat warnings. The Navy had told McVeigh the route was safe. American submarines had destroyed most of Japan's submarine fleet. The few Japanese subs still operational were supposedly hiding in home waters, not hunting in the Central Pacific. McVeigh had no reason to doubt the intelligence. He had been sailing these waters for 3 years. 600 miles away, Japanese submarine I-58 was hunting. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto had taken I-58 to sea on July 16th with orders to find American targets and attack them. I-58 carried 6 forward torpedo tubes loaded with Type 95 torpedoes. The Type 95 was Japan's equivalent of the American Mark 14. Oxygen-powered, long-range, reliable. Unlike the Mark 14, the Type 95 had worked correctly since the beginning of the war. Japanese torpedoes did not suffer from defective depth mechanisms, magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely, or contact exploders that crumpled on impact. Japanese engineers had tested their weapons properly. Japanese submariners trusted their torpedoes. I-58 should not have been operational in July 1945. By that point in the war, American submarines had sunk 201 of the 214 Japanese submarines that had been destroyed. The American submarine campaign had been so effective after fixing the Mark 14 that Japan's submarine force had been nearly annihilated. But I-58 had survived. She had survived because she was new, commissioned in September 1944, after the peak of American submarine operations. And she had survived because from December 1941 through September 1943, American submarines had fired thousands of defective torpedoes at Japanese targets that should have been destroyed, but escaped. If the Mark 14 had worked correctly from the beginning of the war, American submarines would have sunk the entire Japanese submarine fleet by mid-1943. Japanese subs would have been priority targets, hunted systematically. I-58 would never have been built because Japan would not have had the resources or industrial capacity. But the Mark 14 had wasted 2 years, and in July 1945, I-58 was still hunting. At 2300 hours on July 29th, Hashimoto brought I-58 to periscope depth to search for targets. The night was clear, visibility excellent. The moon was nearly full. Perfect conditions for a surface attack. Hashimoto scanned the horizon and saw nothing. He was about to submerge when his lookout spotted a dark shape against the stars. A large ship, steaming at approximately 17 knots on a straight course. No zigzag, no escorts, alone. Hashimoto could not believe what he was seeing. No American warship traveled alone in hostile waters. It was suicidal. The Navy always sent escorts, always ordered zigzag patterns to make targeting difficult. This ship was steaming in a straight line as if the war was already over. Hashimoto positioned I-58 for an attack and waited. On the bridge of Indianapolis, Captain McVeigh had no idea a Japanese submarine was tracking his ship. His radar was operating but detected nothing. I-58 was running on the surface with a minimal profile, almost invisible against the dark water. McVeigh's sonar was operating, but heard nothing. I-58's diesel engines were too quiet to detect at this range. Indianapolis continued on course at 17 knots, 1,195 men aboard. Most were asleep. Some were writing letters home. Some were playing cards in the crew quarters. None of them knew they had 12 minutes to live. At 0:05 hours on July 30th, Hashimoto fired 6 torpedoes from I-58's forward tubes. The Type 95 torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. They did not dive 11 feet too deep like the Mark 14 had done for 14 months. They did not detonate prematurely because of magnetic exploders like the Mark 14 had done through mid-1943. They did not crumple their firing pins on impact like the Mark 14 had done until September 1943. The Japanese torpedoes worked exactly as designed. They always had. 2 torpedoes hit Indianapolis on the starboard bow. The first struck below the waterline near the forward fuel tanks. The explosion tore a hole 40 feet wide in the hull. Seawater flooded into the forward compartments at thousands of gallons per second. The second torpedo hit 30 feet aft of the first, directly below the bridge. The explosion destroyed the communications room, the navigation room, and most of the forward crew quarters. 300 men died instantly, burned alive, crushed by collapsing steel, drowned in compartments that flooded in seconds. The power failed. Indianapolis went dark. Emergency lighting flickered on in some sections, but most of the ship was pitch black. Sailors stumbled through corridors trying to reach their battle stations. Damage control teams tried to assess the flooding, but the forward sections were completely inaccessible. Water was pouring in faster than pumps could handle. The bow was already underwater. Captain McVeigh tried to send a distress signal. The radio was destroyed. He tried to close the watertight doors. Most of the doors were already jammed or blocked by debris. He ordered the crew to abandon ship, but the intercom system was not functioning. Men in the aft sections had no idea what was happening. They felt the explosions, they felt the ship listing, but they had no orders, no information, no way to communicate with the bridge. Indianapolis was sinking bow first. The list increased to 10 degrees, then 15, then 20. Men were sliding across decks. Equipment was breaking loose and crushing sailors. The forward magazines flooded and thousands of rounds of ammunition cooked off underwater. Small explosions rippled through the hull. McVeigh knew his ship was finished. He gave the order every captain dreads: abandon ship. 12 minutes after the torpedoes hit, Indianapolis rolled to starboard and sank. The bow went under first, pulling the rest of the ship down vertically. Men jumped from the deck into the ocean. Some made it. Some were pulled under by the suction as the ship disappeared. Some were killed by debris raining down from the superstructure. Indianapolis sank in 12,000 feet of water. 300 men died with the ship. 895 went into the ocean. The survivors floated in the darkness. Most had life jackets. Some had life rafts. Many had nothing but debris to cling to. The water temperature was 85 degrees, warm enough to survive. But the nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and nobody knew Indianapolis was missing. McVeigh had not been able to send a distress signal. The Navy did not track individual ship movements closely in areas considered secure. Indianapolis was not expected to arrive at Leyte Gulf for another 2 days. Nobody would realize the ship was missing until July 31st at the earliest. And even then, ships were sometimes delayed by weather or mechanical problems. The Navy might not start searching for days. The sun rose on July 30th. 895 men were floating in the Pacific. No food, no fresh water, no shelter from the sun. And the sharks arrived. Oceanic white-tip sharks. They appeared within hours. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They circled the survivors, drawn, oceanic white-tip sharks. They appeared within hours. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They circled the survivors, drawn by the blood, oil, and the thrashing of nearly 900 men in the water. At first, the sharks stayed on the edges of the groups. Men kicked at them, shouted, splashed, tried to look bigger than they were. It did not matter. The sharks were patient. They bumped life jackets from below, testing. They bit at dangling legs. The first attacks began before noon on July 30th. A man would scream, disappear beneath the surface, and then the water around him would turn red. Sometimes pieces floated back up. Sometimes nothing did. As the hours turned into days, the nightmare worsened. The sun burned the men's skin until it blistered and peeled. Salt water soaked their mouths and lips, cracking them open. They had no fresh water, no food. Some men began drinking seawater. Within hours, they went mad. They hallucinated that Indianapolis was still afloat just below the surface. They insisted they could walk back onto the deck. They slipped out of their life jackets and disappeared into the depths while their friends screamed at them to stop. The sharks took the weak first, the wounded, the delirious, the men who drifted away from the main groups. Survivors later said the worst part was the sound, the constant thrashing as sharks attacked at the edges, the sudden silence when a man went under, the begging, the praying, the men arguing about whether God existed while sharks tore their shipmates apart 10 yards away. By the second day, July 31st, the groups had shrunk. Some life rafts had drifted away. Some had capsized. Men fought each other for space on the rafts. Some pushed others off to make room. Discipline broke down. Officers tried to restore order, but many of them were dead. The ocean became a floating asylum. Screaming, crying, laughing, praying, men talking to people who were not there. No rescue ships appeared. No aircraft circled overhead. The Navy still did not know Indianapolis was missing. On August 1st, the third day, the survivors began to understand what was happening. Nobody was coming. They were alone in the middle of the Pacific with no food, no water, and hundreds of sharks. Some men simply gave up. They loosened their life jackets and slipped under the water. Others clung to life with a stubbornness that made no logical sense. They told each other stories. They recited baseball statistics from memory. They described in detail the meals they would eat when they got home. Steaks, ice cream, cold beer dripping with condensation. The sharks never left. They circled day and night. Survivors later estimated that several hundred men were taken by sharks alone. There is no way to confirm the exact number. All that is certain is this. Of the approximately 895 men who went into the water, only 316 would survive. Rescue came by accident. At 10:25 hours on August 2, 1945, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in a PV-1 Ventura bomber out of Peleliu. He was not looking for survivors. He was scanning for Japanese submarines. His radar was malfunctioning. He went to the back of the plane to check the antenna and happened to glance down at the water. He saw an oil slick. Then he saw something else. Tiny specks in the ocean. Too many to be debris. They were moving. He put on his binoculars and realized what he was seeing. Men. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Gwynn immediately radioed his position. The message went out over the Pacific. Downed survivors in the water. Large number. Need rescue. A PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, was dispatched to investigate. Marks found the survivors 2 hours later. What he saw from the air shocked him. Hundreds of men, many half-mad, clinging to life jackets and bits of wreckage. Sharks swimming among them, bodies floating face down, limbs missing, life jackets stained brown with dried blood. Marks was ordered to circle and wait for surface ships. He ignored the order. He landed his PBY on open ocean swells, risking breaking his aircraft in half, and taxied through the survivors, pulling as many as he could on board. When the cabin was full, he had men lashed to the wings with ropes. By nightfall, his aircraft was overloaded and could barely stay afloat. Destroyer escort USS Cecil Doyle arrived after dark and began hauling men aboard. The Doyle turned on her searchlights and pointed them straight into the sky, violating every nighttime combat protocol. Her captain wanted every ship in the area to see where the survivors were. By August 3rd, the rescue was over. Out of 1,195 men aboard USS Indianapolis when I-58's torpedoes struck, 316 were alive. Approximately 300 had died in the initial explosions or gone down with the ship. The rest had died in the water over 5 days from dehydration, exposure, saltwater poisoning, and sharks. It was the worst loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the United States Navy. Then the Navy made it worse. Captain Charles McVeigh was court-martialed. He became the only American captain in World War II to be tried and convicted for losing his ship to enemy action. The charges were failing to zigzag and hazarding his ship. The Navy argued that if McVeigh had ordered zigzag maneuvers, I-58 would have missed or never attacked at all. It was a simple story. The Navy needed someone to blame. McVeigh was the easiest target. The truth was more complicated. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of I-58, testified at McVeigh's trial. He told the court that zigzagging would not have saved Indianapolis. Visibility was excellent. Range was short. I-58 was in perfect firing position. Hashimoto testified that he would have hit the ship, whether it zigzagged or not. The court convicted McVeigh anyway. He was found guilty of hazarding his ship by failing to order zigzag maneuvers at all times. McVeigh retired from the Navy in 1949. He carried the weight of Indianapolis with him for the rest of his life. Survivors wrote him letters telling him they did not blame him. Some families of the dead wrote letters telling him they did. On November 6, 1968, Charles McVeigh walked out onto his front lawn in Litchfield, Connecticut, carrying a Navy-issued revolver. He sat down, held the pistol to his head, and pulled the trigger. He died instantly. In his hand was a small toy sailor, a gift from a child years earlier. It took the United States Navy 32 years to admit it had been wrong. In 1996, a 12-year-old schoolboy named Hunter Scott chose the sinking of USS Indianapolis as the subject of a history project. He interviewed survivors. He read court transcripts. He discovered that the Navy had withheld critical information at McVeigh's trial, including the fact that other ships in the area had not been ordered to zigzag and that the failure to report Indianapolis overdue had delayed rescue by days. Scott brought his findings to Congress. Survivors of Indianapolis testified. So did historians. So did members of McVeigh's family. In October 2000, the United States Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain Charles McVeigh. The resolution stated that McVeigh's record should reflect that he was not at fault for the loss of Indianapolis and her crew. President Bill Clinton signed the resolution into law. 35 years after McVeigh's death, 55 years after Indianapolis sank, the Navy never formally apologized, but the record was finally corrected. The survivors of Indianapolis had another point to make. Many of them spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen that the real blame did not lie with McVeigh alone. It lay with a system that had failed at every level. Intelligence officers who knew Japanese submarines were operating near the route, but did not pass warnings along. Communications officers who saw that Indianapolis had not reported her position and did nothing. And, decades earlier, ordnance officers who had pushed a defective torpedo into service and then refused to admit their mistake. Because behind the horror of Indianapolis was a simple, brutal fact. I-58 was at sea in July 1945 because the American Mark 14 torpedo had failed in 1942 and 1943. If the Mark 14 had worked as designed from the beginning of the war, American submarines would have sunk more Japanese submarines earlier. Japanese shipping would have been strangled in 1942, not 1944. Japan would have had fewer resources to build new submarines like I-58. The boat that torpedoed Indianapolis was a product of time and industrial capacity that should have been denied to Japan.
Time that existed, because American torpedoes failed to explode when they were needed most. There is no way to prove with absolute certainty that I-58 would not have been in that patch of ocean on July 30th, 1945, if the Mark 14 had worked correctly. History does not grant that kind of clarity, but the chain of cause and effect is hard to ignore. 2 years of defective torpedoes kept Japan's shipping and submarine force alive longer than it should have survived. Those extra months allowed ships to sail, submarines to be built, and crews to be trained. One of those crews was Mochitsura Hashimoto's. One of those submarines was I-58. One of those torpedo salvos killed 879 American sailors in 12 minutes and condemned hundreds more to die over 5 days in shark-filled waters. In total, 3,005 American submariners died in World War II. 1 out of every 5 men who served on American submarines did not come home. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. Many of them died attacking enemy ships with weapons that did not work. Many of them never knew why their torpedoes failed. They died believing they had done something wrong, that they had misjudged range or angle or depth. The truth was far simpler and far uglier. The torpedoes were broken. The system that built them refused to admit it. The story of the Mark 14 and USS Indianapolis is not just a story about technology. It is a story about arrogance, about a bureaucracy more concerned with protecting its reputation than protecting its sailors, about engineers who believed their calculations more than the men risking their lives in combat, about how long it took for one admiral, Charles Lockwood, to force the Navy to admit the truth. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk more than 1,300 Japanese ships. They had destroyed over half of Japan's merchant fleet and most of its submarine force. They had starved an empire and helped end the war years earlier than otherwise would have been possible. They did this with corrected torpedoes that finally worked as advertised, but the price of those corrections was measured in lives that could never be repaid. The men of Indianapolis were among the last to pay it. On paper, the Mark 14 torpedo became a success. In reality, it was a weapon that killed almost as many Americans through its failures as it did Japanese through its eventual successes. It turned early submarine patrols into suicide missions. It extended the war. It left a Japanese submarine alive long enough to put 879 Americans into the water on a calm July night in 1945. And it left survivors and families asking the same question. Admiral Lockwood never spoke aloud. How many of them would still be alive if someone in Washington had listened the first time a submarine captain reported that his torpedoes hit a target and did not explode?